Hey, deserving listeners, it's time for me to react to your comments on my videos from last week. Let's get to it. Mike and Natalie videos. GC says, I can't believe Natalie had to hang out in her bedroom all decked out in the wedding dress, anxiously looking out the window in order to know if she was getting married that day or not. That she put up with that crap just shows how desperate she was to get married. These two are just weird, and unless they seek some sort of therapy, this is how it will be for the entirety of their relationship. This is all speculation, of course. Yeah, it's hard to know what's going to happen with the two of them. I could see it going a lot of different ways, and maybe in future seasons we'll find out. Miss Mish says, at first I found myself understanding Mike's frustration with Natalie. It's understanding how things did a 180-degree flip, and she tried so hard to work on things while he became more resistant and distant. I hope they'll let their walls down and communicate more. I always have found myself rooting for this couple. Right, I do hope so as well. It's possible that with marriage and with the certainty of the boundary of the relationship that they might actually both let their walls down a little bit. We'll find out. Or we won't. Because maybe they won't show any new information about that. Melanie says, as Dr. Kirk says, all these problems can be resolved when you go to couples therapy. Maybe now they can attend therapy with Dr. Kirk. Yes, I really hope that they go to couples therapy. I don't have room in my practice, and I wouldn't treat them anyway because I would consider it to be, for lack of a better term, a little bit of a conflict of interest. Katarina says, if I were her, Natalie, I would have huge trust issues for a very long time after this. Yeah, I could imagine that happening. Image text says, I feel like Mike realized he wasn't getting his grandma's ring back and decided he had to do something about it. Well, that's an interesting speculation. Somehow I hope that that's not the case. Ms. Corleone says, I can't help but feel that Natalie went into survival mode. She did not know if she could get back home or how, and did not want to travel during the pandemic. She had a meltdown. Mike felt bad. They made a deal with themselves that marriage was the next necessary step for Natalie's safety. It certainly did seem that way, did it not? Because right up until the last minute, they were done. He was done. She was done. And then they tried to work around the system of like, well, let's extend the visa. Well, first she was going to go home, and then they were going to try to extend the visa. And then when all that failed, they're like, well, I guess we're getting married. So, you know, we'll see. Sometimes that can be the beginning of a successful marriage. It certainly isn't a helpful beginning. Usually in the beginning, you want everyone to be 110% on board, right? Emily says, is anyone else still team Mike plus his hairstylist? As a hairstylist, I met my partner when he was my client. I asked him out and am so glad that I did. It was obvious to me that his hairstylist genuinely cares about him. I just wish for Mike that he dated a laid-back gal who enjoys a beer with a burger, and that Natalie find a man who shares her values and faith. Yeah, it is interesting how that narrative got eclipsed by everything that was happening in the end of the season. It does raise major questions about their compatibility, the way he likes to live his life versus the way she likes to live her life. I guess maybe we'll find out how that works out. Maybe we won't. Andrew and Amira video. Jen says, it sounds like Amira was something Andrew ordered, and since it didn't arrive on time, his mom and sister want someone like Amazon to answer for it. Run away, Amira, and stay away. Kate says, I find it disturbing that Andrew isn't correcting his mom and her take on what happened. He knows it wasn't that simple and what his part in it was. Yeah, it is interesting to think about. I think Andrew's personality is hard to nail down. I think we can derive some hypotheses about it, but it's hard to know. During that scene, that was a frustration, I think, for the viewer, that the family was well, what's wrong with this girl? She just had a panic attack and she called the whole thing off. And we knew that it was much more involved than that. There was ongoing conflicts that had been going on for a long time, and we all probably understood Amira's decision. But the mom seemed to not understand, and then you wonder, well, why wouldn't Andrew speak up and say, well, actually, we got in a huge fight and all this kind of stuff. Why didn't he say that? Well, I don't know. Shame, difficulty, just not wanting to talk about it, or some deception. Hard to say. Nina says, I really appreciate the discussion about being in, so I talked about grief and loss. I really appreciate the discussion about being in grieving and rebuilding modes and how we are allowed to oscillate between the two whenever it's right for the individual. It's great to hear that we can trust our bodies when we're ready to feel feelings and when we're ready to take action. Yeah, so listen to that episode. And I often will talk about the research regarding grief, so if you didn't catch it, I'm sure you'll catch it again. Haha Rachel says, I am a pastor and will 100% apply your warning to not force grief work on people. So helpful. Thank you. You're a pastor. And I'm guessing that you are around grieving people very often. So I'm glad that you're helping people, Rachel. Lavender says, I got the feeling that the sister of Andrew questioned Andrew that way because she doesn't believe his side of the story. The look on her face and tone reads skeptical to me, and it seemed like she was trying to get at it in a roundabout way. That's interesting, Lavender. I could see that the sister knew Andrew's leaving something out, or I bet you Andrew's story here isn't the full story. I know Andrew to be kind of a jerk face sometimes, and I think he's not talking about that. So I'm going to ask these questions in a way that seems curious, but is really trying to get at something. I could see that. Raising Wings says, can you imagine watching this as a parent who sends your kid to his daycare? How fast would you pull your kid out? Yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. The parents of the kids, I mean, not only just for Andrew, but also for the mom, they don't come across very likable. But maybe they are. Maybe the parents who drop their kids off are like, it's a reality show. I know these two people to be very great people. The other thing is that daycares can be few and far between sometimes. My mom had a daycare in our house growing up, and for a long time we were the only daycare. My mom had the only daycare within miles. So if you were going to work, you had two working parents, or you're single parent and working, you had to use the daycare that was close enough so you could drop your kids off and actually get to work. So sometimes that's a factor, but anyway. Stephanie and Harris video. Now it's not Stephanie and Ryan, it's Stephanie and Harris. Hank says, quoting me, you probably don't want to start a fire next to all those dry leaves. Right, so she was starting a fire next to all these dry leaves. And then Hank says, this is both literally and metaphorically the advice this lady needs. Yeah. Jillian says, why did she tape a picture of Harris to the fridge instead of just changing the background picture? Yeah. I guess it's more dramatic and I don't know, more comical if you're just pasting a picture over. Joby says, I'm wondering what happened to Ryan once she broke up with him. Like, did she stop paying his wages? Did he lose his job and find out she was the one paying for him all along? Yeah, well, he knows now because he's been watching the show. Pure Lightword says, on one hand, yes, Stephanie is using her financial resources to get what she wants from these men. So I was talking about the possibility of exploitation of Harris and Ryan. So on one hand, yes, Stephanie is using her financial resources to get what she wants from these men. And in her mind, she may be the one in power. On the other hand, I can totally see how these men have exploited her loneliness and slight desperation for their economic opportunity. A mutual exploitation is happening here, in my opinion. And Harris loves his wife, and they both are getting what they want from Stephanie. Seems odd, but not surprising in some economic situations, what some families are willing to do to get out of poverty. Yeah, it's hard to say. Exploitation is something that this show doesn't usually narrativize, and it's often a question. We don't know, though. We would have to ask, how do you feel, Harris? And how do you feel, Stephanie? And it's usually a little bit more complicated than it might seem on the surface. But exploitation could absolutely be happening. Lana says, hi, Doc. Just wanted to say thank you for your recommendation of the book, Extraordinary Relationships. It was very helpful. Yeah. So go to my website, psychologyinseattle.com. You can click on the other menu and then go to the book recommendations. I have a lot of book recommendations there. Angela and Michael videos. Finally got around to Angela and Michael. Anna says, brace yourself hard, Dr. H. I'm sorry, but this isn't going to be easy at all to watch. Yeah, I think that this couple, at least so far, is not triggering me in a way that some couples have. Even though it would seem intuitive that they would because of the high conflict, it seems less, I don't know, it's just less triggering to me. I'm guessing all of y'all have different sorts of couples that will trigger you, like this couple triggers you, whereas this couple doesn't. I don't know if this couple does so far, but we'll find out. KH says, for a majority of Nigerians, the word fat is just a descriptive word, similar to how you describe someone as tall, short, dark, etc. It's not like most places in the West where the word fat is automatically taken as an insult. Well, thank you, KH. I like to learn about other cultures in this way, and that certainly does provide some context to their conflict there. A misunderstanding of the cultural meaning of the word fat between two people. Fikpa says, as a West African, calling people fat is a normal descriptive word and in some cases a compliment. It rarely has a negative connotation. I think cultural differences were the main catalyst for their issues. Interesting. Thank you, Fikpa. Diary says, when she said, be a man, and he says she's masculine, it's frustrating because we know emotions don't have any gender. Being emotional doesn't make you a girl. Being strong and outspoken doesn't make you a man. Ugh. Yes, completely agree, Diary. All right, Kalani and Asuelu. Finally got to them as well. Elspeth says, Dr. Kirk talking to us is like being wrapped in a warm hug and fed pizza. Oh, I want to be in a warm hug and fed pizza. That sounds nice. Angel Kate says, watching a new 90 Days couple is like the small-scale version of how it feels when you watched the next Star Trek season with a different ship and crew. Kind of boring and slightly awkward at first, then once you get into it, you feel like you know them and desperately need to know what's going to happen next. Well, Angel Kate, you're speaking my language in that way. Every new Star Trek season with a new cast and crew, you are thinking, even Next Generation. I remember watching the first season of that, feeling like, who is this Picard? But by season 4 or something, it's just like all you wanted to watch. I will say though that some Star Trek seasons have not been interesting to me recently. But anyway, Proteus says, my wife is from the Philippines, and she had to adjust to the car seat laws here in the United States, as well as the seatbelt laws. Also, our daughter slept in our bed until she was 8, at which point she moved to her own bed and room on her own. Right. So what Proteus is saying is that, look, in the United States, we have a culture, and it's not the culture. That's what I am frequently telling my trainees. It's okay that you have a culture, and you have a culture, but you don't have the culture. And in your culture, you have an idea about all sorts of things, including safety protocols. For example, seatbelts and car seats. You are entitled to your beliefs and your priorities regarding safety with seatbelts and with car seats. It is real. You are right, but you aren't the only one that is right on the planet. You have a culture, and in everyone in your town, 99.9% of the people agree with you. That doesn't mean that 99.9% of people agree with you around the planet. It also doesn't mean that you are right and everyone else on the planet is wrong. There are various different practices with parenting. And let's just assume that the United States does not have the best way of parenting on the entire planet. Let's just take that into consideration, that our way in the United States and mainstream United States culture, we are not the pinnacle of parenting our children. Now, with safety, maybe we are, but at what cost to other kinds of parenting tasks are we prioritizing safety over? If safety is overshadowing and eclipsing the need for attachment, then what's going on here? And as a culture, when we yell at parents about safety and just ignore the fact that parents aren't really attaching well to their children, what are we doing as a culture? Now, I'm talking in generalities here. But listen to all my other episodes. I have a whole episode on attachment parenting. I actually reran that. It was an episode from 9 years ago on the podcast that gets into a little bit of what I'm talking about here. Parenting is complicated. There are a lot of ways to raise happy, well-attached children, and we just have to slow down, especially with Kehlani Asuelu, before jumping down Asuelu's throat from our mainstream Western ideas about what he's supposed to do. I'm worried about that because not only is Kehlani over-functioning for Asuelu, and not only is Asuelu under-functioning, that we see that pretty quick dynamic where they're both participating in the mother-son dynamic between the two of them. So he's participating in it too. My dog is barking. But I'm also worried about us and me as a viewer also participating in the overfunctioning because Kehlani might be closer to our culture. She might exhibit ideas that are more resonant with us, and Asuelu might seem more strange to us. And what part of that is him underfunctioning? What part of that is just him just being from a different culture? You could make an argument that at least part of the reason why Kehlani looks down on him is because he is a fish out of water in the United States, and he doesn't understand how the culture works, and she's just assuming when he does things differently that he's stupid instead of he was raised differently, and in his culture, she would be the weird one, and he would be the one saying, "What are you doing?" So it's tempting to look at him like he doesn't know what he's doing, but I think we need to consider the fact that he's from a different culture. Jules says, "I know in Malaysia, we do not wear seatbelts as passengers. The only place I've ever been where everyone needs to wear their seatbelt all the time is here in the US." Right. Jacqueline says, "Any tips on what to do if you're an overfunctioner, as I am? I don't want to view my husband as a child, but it's hard for me in general to trust other people to do things and that includes him. And that includes most men, to be honest, in my life." Yeah, Jacqueline. So you are a wise, differentiated individual to recognize, hey, I think I'm an overfunctioner. Now, to change your behavior will help, which obviously the best option is to go to therapy. This is actually right up the alley of what therapy can provide for you. But some general tips to work on in therapy. One is what traumas led to you having to be an overfunctioner when you were a child? Often overfunctioners who are adults were parentified when they were young, meaning that they were forced to grow up too fast because of parents who had alcoholism, or there was divorce, or a parent had an illness or something, or another sibling, one of the children, one of your siblings had a lot of problems, and so you had to overfunction to make up for the fact that this other kid, the sibling of yours, was dragging the family down somehow. So there's a lot of different reasons, and addressing those traumas is important because that's where it all began, and that's where it kind of generates from. The other is all of the assumptions that go into the overfunctioner's mind, which is, I need to be responsible for everything, which isn't necessarily true. Everyone else is stupid, which is an overfunctioner idea. Now, overfunctioners wouldn't say that. They wouldn't say like, yeah, I believe everyone else is stupid. But when it comes down to it, their attitude, the way they approach, especially as you say, Jacqueline, your husband and maybe men in general, is men are stupid and my husband is stupid, or just incompetent is probably a more specific word, a better word, and challenging those ideas. But the problem is you probably chose your husband because he was already an underfunctioner, and his relational traumas would have made him an underfunction regardless of who he was with. So as you try to not overfunction, he's going to continue to underfunction. So that's how systems work. You know, these are complementary relationships. They fit together. They feed off each other. Now, as you lower your overfunctioning, it's likely that he will stop underfunctioning as much. But you'll always have this tendency. And unless you go into couples therapy, it's going to be hard to really overcorrect for, you know, to properly, completely correct for that. Other things you can do is you're seeing him as childish. Well, when you treat, as I've been talking about, when you treat someone as they're a child, they tend to act like children. And the other thing that you can do, and this actually applies to parenting as well. You have a 16-year-old and they're not doing anything, you know, when they clean the bathroom, they always screw it up. Well, one of the ways that you can help to avoid always having to do something for someone is you let them do it, and let's say it's really not a great job. And you walk into the bathroom and you're like, they only got like half the stuff right. So it's a glass half full, glass half empty thing. If you point out everything that they did well and you pat them on the back and you go, wow, you really cleaned the sink really well. Wow, you really cleaned the tub really well. But in your head, you're like, you didn't even touch the floor. You didn't touch the toilet. What's wrong with you? If you go with the glass half full, that infuses pride in someone. And they're like, oh, I thought she was going to yell at me. She usually yells at me. But she's saying that I did a good job with the sink and a good job with the tub. Hey, maybe I am good at cleaning the bathroom. That cascades over time. The next time they clean the bathroom, they might kind of put a little bit of extra love into the toilet. And because they're like, this feels good. The overfunctioner assumption often is everyone is incompetent, and when they're incompetent, I have to pounce on them, because if I don't, then they will always screw things up. It's actually not true. And we know this by behavioral research. This goes for any animal, or any animal that can learn, is we tend to learn much faster, and behavior is shaped much quicker, or even just at all, when we are given positive things for our behavior. When someone does something, you know, when you're trying to train your dog, we have a puppy right now, really 2 young dogs, 1 young dog and 1 puppy, and we're in a constant state of, especially my wife, she's kind of in charge of this process, training our dogs. And a principle that you always hear from the experts is, when the dog is doing something well, that's when you give them a treat. And us as humans, we are the same way. When your underfunctioner is doing the right thing, that's when you reward them. When they're doing the wrong thing, it might help to not actually come down on them hard. And it might not actually change their behavior. Just again, to reiterate, if the child, the 16-year-old, only did half well on the bathroom, and instead of pointing out what they did well, you come in there and go, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you know, and on your face you're disapproving. Now I got to do it myself. The person now is like, oh, even though they might not give off the vibe because they're trying to protect themselves, but on the inside they're shrinking, and they feel small, and they feel incompetent, and they feel like unloved and rejected. Well, what are you going to do when you're in that state? You're going to be like, I hate doing the bathroom. Bathroom sucks. There's nothing good about bathroom cleaning. And I'm generally bad at things. And screw that person, because I worked hard on this bathroom. I've never cleaned a bathroom by myself before. I thought I kind of did a good job. Screw that person. The next time they ask me to do something, I'm going to purposely screw it up because I'm going to show them. And then the cycle goes round and round and round. Anyway. But listen to all my other episodes on overfunctioning and underfunctioning. It's pretty complicated, but and it's hard to get out of, again, because of the traumas that people go through. Anyway, Demi Lovato video, I started doing those. Yo-Yo says, I think one of the most important things is having the right people around you when you're trying to get sober. When I hit bottom, I cut off everyone who had a bad influence on me. After doing that, I had like 2 friends left and no family contact. I was super lonely, but looking back, I'm so glad I did that. I began spending more time with them and really learned how to spend time in a wholesome way from them instead of just mindless partying and being in drama. Also, I found God, and that really helped. Well, good for you, Yo-Yo. It sounds like you have found your path to sobriety. That's really, really great. Sweetie Darling says, I lost a loved one to addiction, and 10 years later, I still struggle with the guilt. Rationally, I know there was nothing I could have done, but when you're the one to find the person, rationality is hard to find. Thank you so much for discussing this subject. Yeah. I'm sorry you went through that, sweetie. I'm not calling you sweet. That's your name on... I'm sorry you went through that, truly. It's a huge loss and can be very complicated in terms of our feeling for it. And guilt is a feeling that we almost always feel to some extent when we lose someone, even if there's no rational reason for it. Adrian says, I really am glad that you highlighted the grief and loss experience that goes along with healing from addiction. It's such an important aspect of substance use that isn't really talked about. Yeah, Adrian. It's a almost universal thing for people that suffer from substance abuse problems sort of in the long term, and they attain sobriety and they work really hard. There's this myth that their life is just going to be wonderful from this point forward because their life was so unmanageable and so self-destructive when they were using. That can be true, and there can be aspects of that, but an almost universal feeling that people will have, especially after they have the initial natural high of sobriety for the first couple months, is a depression or a loss or grief will set in of like, I miss those times. And now I know that I can never have that again. You know, there were good things about using. There were bad things about using. But there were good things. That's why I used. It made me feel good, or I had friends, or it gave me motivation, or it erased my problems. There were good things about that, and now I'm never going to get that. That's depressing. Now I just have to be like a regular, normal, sober, boring person. That, you know, it's a loss. Now the overall is a gain, humongous gain. So that's usually the mantra and the reality that you really convince yourself of, because it's usually true, but it is a loss. So, and the same can go for a lot of things that are bad for us. A bad relationship, for example, a relationship that we really struggled with. And when we finally got out of it, we're like, oh, thank goodness we're out of that relationship. Well, it's not all the time, but we might look back and miss certain aspects of it. And that is normal. It's okay to have those feelings. And it's a problem when we are confused by them, or we don't get support for them, or we beat ourselves up for them. Life is a multi-layered thing, right? We understand that life is complicated, and sometimes we can miss things that we absolutely know we shouldn't go back to. Trish says, super helpful reaction video to Demi Lovato. Very informative. A great reminder to be compassionate and not judge those who struggle with addiction. Yeah. Second that, Trish. Alicia says, thank you for your compassionate approach on the reality of addiction. I'm so tired of people hating on addicts and the discrimination that comes with it. It took me a long time to recover and truly get over the addiction. I can say truly that the itch is gone now. Thank God. Well, good for you, Alicia. Very good for you. I know you probably went through a lot to get there, so good for you. Congratulations. Cheshire Cat says, I also want to know about the intensive trauma retreat and the aftercare. Oh, right. So in the video, Demi was talking about how she went to this, I think, a week-long intensive trauma retreat. And then the day she got out, she relapsed. And I immediately thought, so wait, she had a week-long, and she's been through a lot of traumas, and she had a week-long trauma intensive, and there was no aftercare. There was no concern about the very high likelihood that she would relapse afterwards. Maybe there was aftercare, but I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't. So that's what Cheshire Cat was saying. I also wanted to know about the intensive trauma retreat and the aftercare. When I watched the episode, it immediately set up flags for me too. Was she just sent home on her own? No support? What was that about? I can't imagine being okay after a week of talking about traumas. Yeah, I talk about this occasionally. It's important for everyone to know, including you clinicians, that when people have been legitimately traumatized, meaning that when someone experiences a tremendous amount of terror and they have a physiological distress reaction, and over time this is chronic or significant enough such that someone has reverberating effects later on, like PTSD and other kinds of trauma conditions later in life. The the goal sometimes, if not often, is for the person eventually to talk about those past traumas as a way of integrating them into their lives such that they won't suffer from PTSD or some other trauma condition, such as a personality disorder. So most people understand that in order to heal from one's traumas, we need to talk about those traumas that happened in the past. Not everyone understands that, but most people do, and a lot of clinicians understand that. But the key is that if you suffer from PTSD, complex PTSD, or other kinds of conditions that when you do even think about talking about those things, a massive distress reaction happens for you. Those distress reactions have to be managed very, very carefully. So listen to all my episodes on trauma. Listen to my episodes on trauma therapy. I go into full detail on this. I didn't actually know this in the beginning of my career, and it was a problem. And I know a lot of clinicians out there who actually don't know this as well, and I hear stories. And it's possible that the trauma retreat actually was guilty of this, where they don't understand that, yes, it's good to help people that went through trauma talk about it, but it's actually extremely harmful to just rapidly head into trauma narrative discussions without the person having the ability to manage their distress level and pull out and pace themselves. So it's a very, very complicated thing. And this is one of those things I work on with my trainees that takes months, if not years, for the trainee to really get it. They can get the principles, but it takes a lot of deprogramming as well. But they also have to work, because every client is different when it comes to trauma. But here's the general idea. And of course, talk with your therapist about it. Talk with someone that understands prolonged exposure is maybe the main thing I would look for that people understand. But there are other forms of trauma therapy. Anyway, the point is that in order to recover from trauma, and again, talk with your clinician about this, you need to be exposed to the trauma on some level. If you actually have PTSD or some other related trauma condition, you have to be exposed. You have to experience it, and the way we experience it is by telling the story. And when we tell the story of the trauma, we re-experience it. We call this imaginal exposure, because you're exposing. Let me back up even further. So, if you're afraid of spiders, we know as clinicians how to, in all likelihood, cure you of your fear of spiders. You are terrified of spiders. So you see a spider on the television, you just see a movie, a documentary about spiders, and your heart rate goes up. Well, the way that one can eventually just have a spider walking up and down their arm is through prolonged exposure, and it's gradual and it's very planned out. So in the beginning, the person might just think about spiders, and so let me even back up further. So before you even begin exposure, you have to know your emotions and know how to control them. And most people don't know either one of these things. Most people don't know their emotions very well, and two, they don't know how to control their emotions very well. We call this emotional regulation and awareness. So these skills have to be taught first. And so to go off the spider situation, prolonged exposure, with the individual, we have to ask the client, do you know how distressed you are? And can you immediately know, in the moment, on a scale from 1 to 10, how distressed are you? A 1 is no distress, 10 is you're about to explode, 5 is like significantly distressed. So, but not too bad. You're agitated, but you're within tolerable limits. Does someone have the ability to know in the moment, yes, I am a 5? And are they able to rate themselves in between sessions? This is very important in trauma recovery and in phobia recovery. A lot of people, it takes them a long time to know that. I've worked with some clients for years on that one task of helping them to rate their distress level in between sessions effectively. It's hard, because when you go through trauma, one of the ways that you deal with it is by suppressing your emotions, cutting yourself off from your body, which is your primary source of emotional awareness. So it can take a long time. But anyway, so that's number one. Number two is you have to be able to regulate your distress level, which is also very hard. When you're an 8, what do you do to reduce it? How can you bring yourself down to a 4? It's very, very hard. There's usually ways that everyone can achieve that, but that can take another 3 years of therapy. Sometimes it only takes 3 sessions, but sometimes it takes a long time. Anyway, so once you have those things in place, which are not guaranteed, like I said, take a long emotional distress awareness and distress management in the moment, effective stress, meaning you have 15 different ways of reducing your distress. And I'm not talking about like taking a vacation, because you need to do something right then. You need to be able to like, okay, deep breaths, or go to your happy place, or hug your cat, or, you know, exercise, or listen to music. Or, you know, there needs to be something you can do right then. Okay. So then we go into helping someone eliminate their fear of spiders. So in session, we have the client think about a spider, and then I ask the client, what's your distress level? And they'll say, I'm a 3. I'm a 3 right now. Not too bad. Okay. Now I want you to think about the spider maybe in your hand. Just imagine, close your eyes, think about a spider crawling around your hand. What's your distress level now? And, you know, I'm describing it in very brief. You know, this would be strung out over a long period of time. The client says, oh, I'm a 6. I'm a 6. Okay. So utilize your distress man. We don't want you to go up to an 8, because if you go up to an 8, this will actually re-traumatize you and make your phobia worse. That's the key. If you go up to an 8 or a 9, you are risking actually making your phobia worse. So I have to monitor that in the client. The only way I can monitor it is if they know what their distress level is, and they know how to reduce their because if say, for instance, I just did phobia treatment with someone right from the beginning, and I said, imagine a spider being in your hand, and I say, how distressed are you? And they're like, well, I don't know. I don't feel like I'm very distressed. But let's say they are a 9, but they're just not aware of it. Well, in this process, my treatment is actually re-traumatizing them and making their phobia worse. Okay, so I have to trust the client when I say, what level of distress are you having? I need to be able to know that they know that how to monitor that. Also, so let's say, okay, I'm a 6. Okay, we don't want to go higher than that. So what are you going to do? Okay, while you're imagining the spider in your hand, you're deep breathing. You're doing box breathing. You know, in, hold, out, hold, in, you know, whatever it is that you're doing. Okay, what's your stress level now? I'm a 4. I'm better, but I'm still freaking out there because I'm imagining a spider. Okay, and we do this for a long period of time. And half an hour in, what's your distress level? Are you thinking about the spider in your hand? Yes, yes. What's your distress level? I don't know. I'm kind of a 2. I'm not great, but I still imagine. Okay. So then the next time we do the same thing. Imagine a spider in your hand. I'm a 2. It's not too bad. So what's happening here? We call this habituation. In behavioral theory, this is the well-known phenomenon for many animals, that when you expose yourself to something over time, your body and mind habituate to it. It's the same way that for us, most of us, we can wear shoes and it won't bother us. Why is that? Well, because when we were children, we were forced to wear shoes. We didn't like wearing shoes, but we were forced to, and our bodies eventually habituated to it. So in the same way that when you have a cat box in your house, you don't smell the cat box so much anymore because you habituate. You have nose blindness, they call it, but a stranger comes in your house that doesn't have a cat in their house, and they instantly smell your cat box. It's a similar kind of thing. Anyway, so we're trying to habituate the body to the stimulus of the spider, and then it's watching a spider on the television. Oh, I'm a 6. Okay, we hold that there, and eventually the person habituates to that, and they don't have as much distress when they're looking at a spider on the screen. Eventually, we work our way down the line in terms of intensity, and they can actually hold a spider in their hand, a tarantula, and they're like a 2. Now, if we went from all the way to the tarantula in their hand from the very first session, their distress would spike so hard that they would actually be even more afraid of spiders, and they would never come back to therapy rationally. So we gradually work our way there. Every step of the way, the person is habituating to it. They are staying under a 6 out of 10 or under a 5 out of 10, so they're not re-traumatizing themselves. But they need to have some distress. Otherwise, the stimulus isn't scary enough. There needs to be some level of distress so that you can habituate to it. Okay, so that's for phobias. That's how we treat phobias. It works. If you have a phobia of planes or bridges or medical procedures. There is a way, and it's called prolonged exposure, and it works. When you do it right, it absolutely does work. I have anxiety myself. I've done it to myself, and it works. If it doesn't completely eliminate it, but it works. And you have to find someone that knows what they're doing. And again, you have to understand your emotions, and you have to understand how to regulate them in the moment, which isn't easy to do. The same applies to trauma therapy, that we want the person to habituate to the traumatic memories. If we go in session 1 or, in a week of trauma intensive, and we just ask them to tell us about all their traumas, and they're spiking like this, and they don't even know they're spiking, or even if they know they're spiking, they don't know how to reduce it over time, then this is actually re-traumatizing them. It's actually making the traumas even more associated with pain and distress and fear and all this kind of stuff. Whereas if you do prolonged exposure at a tolerable level, it's not going to be comfortable, but it's not an 8 or a 9. It's a 4. It's not fun, but if you prolong the exposure, meaning like 30 to 40 minutes of the imaginal exposure, the body eventually habituates. So in order for a therapist to effectively treat someone with trauma, they have to remember what we went through. I have to know the client understands their distress level. I have to be very confident. I have to know that they can regulate their distress level if I ask them to, and on their own. Then in the moment when we start doing imaginal exposure, I need to know that they can tell me what their distress level is. And if it starts to get a little too high, I can ask them, hey, use one of your 15 different techniques to bring it back down, because I don't want them to go to an 8 or 9, because that will re-traumatize them, make it worse, and they might relapse on substances afterwards as a way of coping with the severe problems that they're going through. And all of this also, the person has to not only be good at that in session, as I'm prompting them, I'm asking, what number are you? Okay, employ your system. But they have to do it. They have to be able to do it independently. They have to demonstrate to me that they're going to do it independently. Because in between the exposure, I'm not with them 24/7. I'm with them 1 or 2 hours a week. In between sessions, they're going to have spikes as well, because when you do trauma work, it comes up for you a lot. So I need to know that in between sessions, the client is going to be driving on the road. They have a wave of trauma distress that overcomes them. I need to be confident in them that they'll recognize it and go, oh no, I'm a 4. It's what's happening right now. Okay, I got to pull over. I got to do my deep breathing, and I got to bring myself back down to a 2. And then I need to tell everyone around me, by the way, I'm going through trauma recovery, so I need accommodations at work. I need accommodations for my spouse. I need accommodations for my kids. And everyone understands, because trauma recovery involves a village. So I need to understand that. So if I don't believe that a client will monitor effectively and act effectively to reduce their distress level, we still do not start the exposure process. So for Demi Lovato, we have no idea. But when she entered the trauma-intensive week of therapy, were the clinicians confident that she understood her distress level and would monitor whether they were there or not? 2, were they confident that she would be able to reduce her distress level without using substances in between sessions, and especially after the week of trauma workshop intensive? And 3, did she have a village around her that understood how to help her immediately, especially in the first few days of leaving the trauma intensive? Or is it just some stupid workshop that is marketed towards people as, hey, do you have trauma? Well, come to our trauma intensive, and you'll look at all these reports we have, anecdotal reports from clients saying how wonderful it was. Meanwhile, they're not doing anything that's evidence-based. They have no idea what they're doing. And when people walk out the door, because the thing is that when trauma recovery individuals have problems, because of what they went through as children, they'll blame themselves. So it wouldn't be unusual for Demi to leave who knows, maybe this trauma intensive was the best thing, most evidence-based, wonderful thing. But let's live in a world where the trauma intensive week was actually not so great, and it wasn't very evidence-based, and it wasn't very responsible. Demi leaves, immediately uses, possibly because of the abuse she essentially went through in the trauma, in the treatment protocol, and then proceeds to have a relapse and then blames herself. Why is she blaming herself? Well, one, she doesn't know what proper treatment is supposed to look like. And two, when you're abused, you tend to blame yourself. You tend to say, I'm a loser. It's my fault. If I were a better person, I wouldn't do this sort of thing. When in reality, someone actually abused you through their treatment of you. And how would you know that that happened? Because there's no information out there. And if you went to a clinician and asked them, it's not guaranteed that that clinician would even know what proper trauma treatment even looks like. Again, as I said in the beginning of my career, I didn't understand because no one taught me. They taught me what they thought was proper trauma treatment, but it was not proper trauma treatment. And you can go through graduate school without ever learning any of the things that I just told you. We have a problem in our industry, and it is harming people every day in my anecdotal experience. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is one of the best things to say, there's two things. One is if you're a clinician and some of this stuff is like, that sounds like information I want to learn about. So if you're a clinician, find someone that truly understands trauma recovery, particularly prolonged exposure. EMDR, maybe, cognitive processing therapy, maybe, but really the principles of prolonged exposure are the most important, and a supervisor mentor who understands how to individualize that to each client. That's why I'm not a huge fan of EMDR or cognitive processing and trauma-focused CBT, because these are manualized treatment protocols that tend to act like you can shove every client into the same box, which you cannot. I have worked with some clients on prolonged exposure for 7 years. Well, all the other manualized evidence-based treatment protocols are short-term. They're, it's like 30 or 10 to 30 sessions or something. So you need to understand the principle, and all of them involve some level of prolonged exposure. Anyway, then you find a mentor that can help you as you are treating all these different clients who have PTSD, complex PTSD, borderline personality disorder, depression as a result of the trauma, whatever. There's all these various conditions that can happen out of trauma. And you go to the mentor, and the mentor will be like, oh, well, let's think about it this way. Let's pull back. Let's work on it. Because the other thing is, clients don't just show up and go, hey, I have PTSD. Help me with that. That never happens. It's never happened to me. They come to therapy and say, my life is in shambles. I'm going through a divorce. My kids hate me. I'm losing my job. I'm crying myself to sleep every night. I have back pain. Oh, and by the way, I think I have PTSD. It's never clean. So there's all these things you have to consider. Anyway, and I'm experiencing sexism and racism and, all these other things that are happening to them. Anyway, so you need that mentor that understands this to what. The other thing I'll say is that if you're someone who has a trauma condition, or you suspect you do, find someone that really understands what I'm saying. And the way that you can test that is by asking them on the phone, I think I have childhood trauma, or I think I have a trauma condition. How would you help me with that? If they say something along the lines of what I've been saying, then it could be an indication that they are effective. Hard to know, but it's at least a step in the right direction. If they have a very floppy answer, or they have an answer that doesn't seem to make any sense, then we don't really know, but it probably indicates they don't know what they're doing. I don't know, or I shouldn't say probably, it possibly indicates they don't know what they're doing. There's a lot of therapists out there who even will advertise themselves as trauma specialists when they actually, according to my observation, have not only no idea what they're doing, but they are harming their clients because they don't know what they're doing. Because session one, they're like, tell me about your traumas. Because that's how they were taught. Because the people that taught them didn't know either. Because they didn't read the research. Anyway, I feel like I rambled for a while, but listen to my episodes on trauma and trauma therapy for more information. And obviously, talk to a clinician that understands this sort of thing. All right, final comment. 610 says, when we recreate our traumas, are we actually seeking corrective experiences but failing to find them? Yeah, so that's one reason. There's a lot of reasons why we recreate our traumas. One is that we're seeking a corrective experience and failing to find them. Sometimes we actually do manage to find corrective experiences, but a lot of times we don't. Also, it's possible that people will recreate their traumas because it's the devil we're familiar with it. We like to recreate things that we're familiar with, especially when we feel unsafe. So it's this paradox where we feel unsafe because of the traumas we went through. And when we feel unsafe, we tend to gravitate towards things that we are familiar with, which might actually be abusive individuals and lifestyles. Also, when you're being raised and you're being abused, you're not just being abused by your parents. You're actually also being loved on some level, given attention on some level. So love and abuse become fused into one thing. And when you're seeking love, you're actually also seeking abuse. Also, some people will seek out abusive people on purpose because then they can say, well, at least I chose it. So I often will talk about this. It's like, I can either sit here and wait to be abused, and like that'll be awful, or I can make a choice to abuse myself, and that sucks that I'm being abused, but at least I'm the one making that choice. So I'm getting at least a little bit of power out of the equation rather than complete powerlessness. Another is that we will force the conscious mind to acknowledge it when we are naturally suppressing something because no one is listening or it's hard to deal with. The unconscious mind will be trying to tell us, hey, you have something down here that needs to be dealt with. And so I'm going to unconsciously push you in a direction such that you'll re-experience it and maybe then you'll get help for it. Another is that some people learned when they were young that in order to get any kind of love and attention, they have to destroy themselves so that people will notice. So for some kids, when they're like, hey, I want love, no one loves them. Or, hey, I want attention, no one pays attention to them. Or they start running around and saying, hey, look how fast I can run, no one pays attention. So they learn by the circumstances that they were given that if they fall off the roof and break their arm, then they get attention. If they get into a fight at school, that's when they get attention. It's negative attention, but it's attention. It's some kind of love, some kind of like acknowledgement that you exist. And so some people will throw themselves off the cliff into an abusive relationship with this unconscious hope that then they'll finally get the love and attention that they need. Of course, they're re-traumatizing themselves. And so through therapy, we can learn these impulses and we can get our needs met in other ways, power, attention, love, security, without having to resort to these things. All right. I rambled a lot today, but some intense stuff. And I guess I should put a trigger warning at the beginning of this. And by the way, always with everything that I do, there's a trigger warning. This is a psychology podcast. So there's always a chance that I'm going to go into a variety of different triggering material. So I hope that you're okay out there. And the way to react to triggering material is to know it's triggering to you, which isn't guaranteed, which means you have to go to therapy. In therapy, you will learn these sets of things trigger me. You have to know your emotions, which therapy helps with. And then when you notice that, similar with the exposure I was talking about earlier, it's like, oh, this video is triggering me, but I'm a 3, so I'm okay. So what needs to be present? Well, the individual has to know their distress level. And if it's a 6, they have to know how to help themselves by turning off the video or doing their deep breathing or something like that. So anyway, the way to help yourself is to turn off the video, do your activities that you know to do in therapy, that you've worked on with your therapist to help reduce your distress level, because it would really pain me to learn or know that anything that I did on the internet or otherwise was actually hurting someone. So always pace yourself, know yourself, go to a therapist that understands distress, and trauma recovery and all those kinds of things. I'm losing my words because I've been talking for so long. All right, everyone. Please, please take care of yourself and take care of others because we all deserve it. We really, really do.